One vote. That's all it took in 1947 to ignite a conflict still reshaping the Middle East today. How could a single decision at the United Nations fracture communities, turn neighbors into enemies, and unleash a struggle that would ripple across the globe for generations? A vote that promised peace but delivered chaos and left scars still shaping today's world. This isn't just a story of diplomats and shifting borders. It's about families forced from homes they'd lived in for centuries, cities transformed into war zones overnight, and a land where dreams of peace collided with bitter realities. And these patterns of forced displacement, simmering ethnic tensions, and sudden border changes echo in today's headlines, from Ukraine to Sudan, proving that the lessons of 1947 are far from relics of the past. Today on Armchair Archaeology, we'll follow the path from the UN Partition Plan's ambitious promise to the violent struggles that followed, tracing how fear, politics, and faith made compromise impossible. And stay with us until the end because we'll reveal a little-known chapter of the story, how the first days of war in Palestine helped inspire a global movement for human rights, shaping a document that still defines justice and freedom around the world. If stories like these help you see today's world through the lens of the past, consider subscribing to Armchair Archaeology. Join a community that believes exploring history is the key to understanding our present. And don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss our deep dives into moments that still shape us. The ink on the UN Partition Plan was barely dry when violence erupted across Palestine. On November 30th, 1947, just one day after the UN's historic vote, fighting broke out in Jerusalem and quickly spread to cities and villages throughout the land. Jewish and Arab militias, each convinced that the plan threatened their very survival, launched attacks that shattered any remaining trust. The term militia here refers to armed groups formed by civilians, not formal state armies. And these militias would soon transform local skirmishes into a brutal civil war. Street battles flared in places like Jaffa and Tel Aviv, while bombs tore through crowded markets and buses, killing civilians indiscriminately. Jewish forces, including the well-organized Haganah and more radical groups like the Irgun, clashed with Arab fighters in bands and local militias, turning neighborhoods into deadly front lines. British police and soldiers, still the official authority under the Mandate system, an arrangement where Britain ruled Palestine after World War I, increasingly withdrew to fortified areas, unable or unwilling to stop the chaos. The speed of this spiral into violence was staggering. How could neighbors turn into enemies overnight? As the violence escalated, a single spark could trigger mass killings, as happened during a December 1947 clash at the Haifa oil refinery. There, a fight between Arab and Jewish workers spiraled into a massacre, leaving more than 40 Arab laborers dead and unleashing immediate Arab reprisals on Jewish civilians across the region. This horrific incident showed how everyday disputes could become deadly in an atmosphere of fear and rage. These early battles not only signaled the total breakdown of coexistence, but also set patterns we see in conflicts today. Once communal violence begins, it spreads rapidly, transforming towns into battlegrounds and ordinary people into victims of cycles of revenge that can last for generations. As violence spread through late 1947 and early 1948, Palestinian communities began abandoning their homes in terror. What started as scattered departures turned into a massive, irreversible exodus that would reshape the Middle East. By the war's end, more than 750,000 Palestinians had fled or been forced from towns, cities, and villages they and their ancestors had inhabited for centuries, an event Palestinians remember as the Nakba, or catastrophe. The chaos of fighting, combined with deliberate expulsions by some Jewish militias, created rivers of refugees. Roads became clogged with families carrying only what they could fit on carts or their backs. Homes were left with meals half-eaten and doors unlocked, as many believed they'd return in days, never imagining they'd face decades, even lifetimes in exile. Refugees flooded neighboring countries, where hastily built camps of tents and tin shelters soon became sprawling semi-permanent cities, places where hope of return mixed with rising bitterness. Imagine leaving your home so suddenly that dinner is still warm on the table, convinced you'd be back in days, only to find yourself exiled for generations. In April 1948, Deir Yassin, a village near Jerusalem, became the scene of one of the conflict's most shocking massacres. When Jewish fighters attacked, more than 100 men, women, and children were killed. News of the massacre spread rapidly through Arab communities, igniting panic that emptied dozens of villages overnight. This shocking event illustrates how terror can become a weapon in war, forcing entire populations to flee in fear, a pattern tragically repeated in modern conflicts, from Bosnia in the 1990s to Syria's civil war today. By May 1948, the Nakba was fully underway. Generations later, descendants of these refugees, now numbering in the millions, still live in camps or marginalized communities across the Middle East, carrying deeds and keys to homes they've never seen, ensuring that displacement remains one of the most painful and unresolved legacies of this conflict, and a major obstacle in peace efforts today. As we trace the devastating journeys of families fleeing their homes during the Nakba, it's worth asking, what other forgotten migrations and lost civilizations might hold clues about how displacement reshapes societies? In our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World, Mysteries, Technologies, and Lost Civilizations, we explore ancient collapses and migrations that changed history in ways that still echo today. If you're curious, you'll find a link in the pinned comment below. Nowhere captured the ferocity and symbolism of the 1947-48 conflict like Jerusalem. As fighting broke out, fierce battles erupted for control of the city, which holds sacred sites for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Jewish and Arab militias clashed in narrow alleys, turning neighborhoods into front lines where ancient stone walls echoed with gunfire. The holy city's divided loyalties made every street a potential flashpoint, and any advance or retreat carried profound religious and political significance. And in Jerusalem, every street told a story of faith, fear, and fierce determination. Jerusalem quickly splintered into a tense patchwork of Jewish and Arab enclaves. Snipers and roadblocks made daily life perilous, while vital supply routes turned into deadly gauntlets. Civilians risked crossing invisible lines for food or medicine, often paying with their lives. By the time a ceasefire froze positions in 1948, Jerusalem was split in two. Israeli forces controlled West Jerusalem, while Jordanian forces held East Jerusalem and the Old City. These lines hardened into a divided city, a scar that remains visible today. The struggle for control produced extraordinary feats of improvisation and desperation. As Arab forces besieged Jewish neighborhoods and cut the main supply route, Jewish fighters and volunteers carved a rugged detour through rocky hills under constant threat, nicknaming it the Burma Road after World War II's famous Asian supply line. This improvised road kept Jerusalem's Jewish population supplied with food and medicine, proving how far each side would go to claim the city. Jerusalem's unresolved status became the beating heart of the conflict. The 1947 UN plan had envisioned it as an international city belonging to no nation, but war swept away that idea, leaving rival claims that continue to fuel clashes today, and ensuring the city remains a symbol of both hope and heartbreak in the Middle East. To truly understand why the UN Partition Plan ignited such fierce conflict, we need to look at the borders it proposed, a map as bold as it was flawed. The UN plan divided mandatory Palestine into two states, a Jewish state covering about 55% of the land and an Arab state with roughly 45%. Jerusalem, with its sacred sites, was to become an international city under UN control, a neutral space meant to keep peace among competing faiths and nations. But the map looked less like a clear division and more like a tangled jigsaw puzzle. Jewish and Arab territories were broken into awkward, disconnected patches, connected by narrow corridors that made both states nearly impossible to defend or govern. This convoluted geography virtually guaranteed conflict the moment either side challenged the new lines. And in many places, Jewish and Arab communities were so intertwined that drawing borders created enclaves of each group within the other's territory, setting up flashpoints for violence. What made the plan even more explosive was its allocation of land and resources. Though Jews made up only about 1/3 of Palestine's population, the Jewish state received fertile coastal areas and most of the vast Negev desert, while many Arab-majority regions were left landlocked, isolated, and cut off from ports or major roads. This imbalance convinced Arab leaders the plan was a grave injustice, not a fair compromise, and fueled their determination to reject it entirely. Maps have shaped many modern crises by imposing arbitrary borders, from Africa's colonial lines to Iraq's post-World War I boundaries. The UN's 1947 map turned Palestine into a powder keg, proving once again that borders drawn in distant halls, without local consensus, can ignite wars lasting generations. It makes you wonder, can peace ever be built on lines drawn far from the people who live with them? On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly gathered to cast one of its most consequential votes, whether to approve the partition of Palestine into 2 states. The tension in the chamber was electric. Weeks of intense lobbying had swayed votes in both directions, with Zionist leaders pushing desperately for support and Arab states warning that partition would bring endless war. This vote would not only determine Palestine's future, but set the tone for the entire Middle East. As each of the 56 member states called out yes, no, or abstain, every word echoed across the world. Radio broadcasts carried the vote live, and Jewish and Arab communities everywhere held their breath. In a move that shocked many, the United States and the Soviet Union, fierce Cold War rivals, both backed the plan. This rare agreement showed how the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust had reshaped global priorities, convincing leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain that a Jewish state was a moral necessity. Meanwhile, Arab states and their allies denounced the plan as an outrage against self-determination, arguing that it handed over Arab-majority lands to a Jewish minority. In the end, 33 nations voted in favor, 13 opposed, and 10 abstained, just enough for the plan to pass with the required 2/3 majority. The razor-thin margin revealed how deeply divided the world was, not just in the region, but globally, setting the stage for Palestine to become a battleground in the Cold War. This wasn't just a regional vote, it was a decision that would ripple through every corner of the world. Today, many conflicts from Korea to Ukraine remind us how international votes can reshape lives far from the conference halls, proving that a single decision by world powers can unleash ripples of conflict for decades to come. If the razor-thin UN vote and the shattered hopes it set in motion make you see how fragile peace can be, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep bringing these stories of moments where the course of history changed forever.
To see why compromise seemed impossible, we have to rewind to the deep roots of distrust. Long before the UN Partition Plan or the first shots of civil war, the roots of conflict in Palestine had been firmly planted. For centuries, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived under a system called the millet, which allowed communities to govern their own religious affairs. This arrangement wasn't equal, but it kept tensions at bay for generations. After the Ottoman collapse in World War I, Britain and France carved the Middle East into new territories through secret deals like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, placing Palestine under British mandate, essentially a colonial administration sanctioned by the League of Nations. But Britain soon made promises it couldn't keep. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, it pledged support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, even as it reassured Arab leaders it would champion independence for Arabs across the region. These contradictory promises planted deep mistrust among Jewish and Arab communities living side by side. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, clashes over Jewish immigration and land purchases fueled violence. Arab revolts against British rule and Jewish settlements erupted, leading the British to crack down brutally with curfews, arrests, and executions that radicalized both sides. As fear spread, both communities began forming militias, Jewish defense groups like the Haganah and Arab fighters determined to resist what they saw as a foreign invasion. These rival armed groups transformed Palestine into a powder keg, where every clash pushed both peoples closer to believing compromise was impossible. This spiraling distrust shows how broken promises and rising militancy can turn neighbors into enemies, a pattern tragically mirrored in modern conflicts where outside powers meddling stokes local tensions into lasting wars. The Holocaust, in which 6 million European Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany, transformed global attitudes toward Jewish statehood. Before World War II, Zionist leaders had already worked for decades to build support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but their arguments met resistance from many world powers. After the Holocaust horrors became undeniable, the case for a Jewish state gained a moral urgency it had never held before. If Jews could be exterminated so ruthlessly in Europe, where could they ever be truly safe without sovereignty? This urgency resonated beyond Jewish communities. Shocking images of emaciated survivors emerging from concentration camps spread worldwide, shifting public opinion in many Western countries. Leaders who had been reluctant to endorse Zionism now felt creating a Jewish state was a moral imperative. In the United States, President Truman championed Jewish immigration to Palestine, motivated by humanitarian concern and pressure from American Jewish communities desperate to resettle Holocaust survivors. Meanwhile, British policies that had restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, originally designed to avoid angering local Arabs, came under fierce criticism. When ships like the Exodus 1947, carrying thousands of Holocaust survivors, were turned back by British patrols and forced to return to Europe, the world was outraged. These scenes of Jewish refugees just months after liberation from death camps being denied entry became powerful symbols of betrayal and galvanized sympathy for the Zionist cause. The Holocaust didn't just intensify Jewish demands for a homeland, it reframed the global debate, shifting the question from whether a Jewish state was ideal to whether it was an urgent necessity. This reframing helped rally crucial support for partition, even among nations previously opposed to Zionist ambitions.
By 1947, Britain's hold on Palestine was collapsing. Years of violence between Jewish and Arab communities, combined with British exhaustion after World War II, made continued colonial rule unsustainable. In February 1947, Britain announced it would end its mandate, a League of Nations-sanctioned administration giving Britain control over Palestine, and hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations, hoping an international solution might succeed where British rule had failed. In response, the UN created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, composed of representatives from 11 countries assigned to investigate the situation firsthand. That summer, UNSCOP delegates traveled the length of Palestine, visiting Jewish settlements, Arab villages, and overcrowded refugee camps, listening to passionate and conflicting testimonies from both communities. They witnessed a land on the brink. One morning, they would tour modern Jewish agricultural collectives, or kibbutzim, guided by armed Haganah guards eager to showcase Jewish achievements. The next day, they would meet fearful Arab villagers convinced that partition meant permanent exile and loss of their homes. Everywhere UNSCOP went, they encountered a society where trust had already collapsed. These tense, sometimes volatile encounters made it clear to many committee members that neither side believed coexistence in a single state was possible without catastrophic violence. The urgency and despair they observed convinced most delegates that partition was the only practical way to avoid an immediate regional war. By September 1947, UNSCOP recommended creating 2 separate states, along with placing Jerusalem under international administration. The difficulties UNSCOP faced still resonate today. Whether in Bosnia, Kosovo, or South Sudan, the UN often struggles to mediate between communities hardened by fear and hatred. Palestine showed how even the best-intentioned plans can fail when mutual distrust has already set deep roots. Hearing how the UN struggled to craft a plan for peace in a land already fractured by fear makes you wonder, have past civilizations faced similar moments where compromise seemed impossible?
Our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World, dives into how lost empires tried, and often failed, to unite divided peoples. The link is waiting for you in the pinned comment if you'd like to explore deeper. What began as a civil war between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine soon escalated into a full-scale regional conflict. When Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, 5 neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, now Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, immediately invaded, determined to crush the new Jewish state and prevent what they saw as the permanent dispossession of Palestinian Arabs. The battles that followed, known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, did more than redraw Palestine's map. They redefined alliances and enmities across the Middle East for decades to come. These interventions turned the conflict from a local struggle into an international crisis. The Soviet Union, eager to weaken lingering British and French colonial influence in the region, became one of the first countries to recognize Israel, surprising many. Meanwhile, the United States, after some hesitation, emerged as Israel's principal backer, seeing the fledgling state as a potential democratic partner in a region critical for global oil supplies. In response, Arab states began turning to the Soviet bloc for weapons and diplomatic support, laying the groundwork for the Middle East to become a key theater of the Cold War. A powerful sign of how globalized the conflict had become came when the UN appointed Count Folke Bernadette as its first official peace mediator. Bernadette successfully negotiated temporary ceasefires and proposed new borders to limit the fighting, but his assassination by Jewish extremists in Jerusalem in September 1948 horrified the world, revealing how outside efforts to impose peace could end in bloodshed. Palestine had become a global chessboard, with every move watched and exploited by powerful nations. The war's outcome entrenched Israel's survival and expansion, deepened Palestinian displacement, and hardened Arab animosity. These legacies turned Palestine into a permanent fault line in international affairs, echoing in today's proxy wars where local conflicts draw in superpowers, like in Syria and Yemen. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the lessons of 1947 apply to crises unfolding today? Or is peace only possible with new approaches? Share your ideas in the comments below. Your insights inspire our next investigations.
By the time armistice lines were drawn in 1949, the consequences of the 1947 UN Partition Plan were etched into the Middle East's landscape and memory. More than 750,000 Palestinian refugees were scattered across camps in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, many living in tents or makeshift shelters with hopes of return that remain unfulfilled generations later. Israel, meanwhile, had expanded beyond the UN's proposed borders, ultimately controlling about 78% of former mandatory Palestine. The West Bank and East Jerusalem came under Jordanian control, while the Gaza Strip fell to Egypt, creating new, uneasy frontiers that redefined the region. These hastily established borders hardened into enduring fault lines. Jerusalem's division became the starkest symbol of the conflict's complexity. Israel declared the city its eternal capital, while Palestinians and Arab states insisted East Jerusalem must serve as the capital of a future Palestinian state. This unresolved issue, first crystallized in the chaotic aftermath of 1948, still ignites protests, clashes, and international disputes today, demonstrating how the city remains a potent symbol of both faith and fury. Meanwhile, the refugee crisis grew into one of the world's longest-running humanitarian tragedies. Camps evolved into dense urban neighborhoods, where families passed down deeds and keys to homes lost in 1948, keeping alive a shared sense of injustice that continues to fuel anger and resistance. These refugees and their descendants, now numbering in the millions, represent one of the most intractable obstacles to peace, with each failed negotiation adding new layers of bitterness. The unresolved questions of 1947, secure borders, the rights of refugees, and the status of Jerusalem remain central obstacles to peace today.
They remind us how decisions made decades ago can lock entire regions into cycles of conflict, proving the past's power to shape every attempt at reconciliation. The UN Partition Plan of 1947 was envisioned as a blueprint for peace, a chance to balance the hopes of Jewish survivors seeking a homeland with the rights of Palestine's Arab majority. Yet the moment the plan passed, it unleashed a series of events that transformed dreams of coexistence into decades of conflict, displacement, and war. Lines drawn by diplomats far from Jerusalem's narrow streets hardened into frontiers soaked with blood, and decisions made in the echoing halls of the United Nations shaped the destinies of millions who had no voice in the debate. What began as an attempt to resolve one of the world's most complex political dilemmas instead created a conflict that has outlasted empires, kings, presidents, and generations of negotiators. The wounds left by forced exile, rival claims over Jerusalem, and the bitterness of communities torn apart remain as raw today as they were in 1948. Each new clash, every failed peace effort, and every headline from the region reminds us that the legacy of the partition plan is not a relic of the past, but a living reality shaping the lives of Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider world. Through every clash and every failed peace talk, echoes of 1947 still shape today's world. And, as promised at the beginning of our exploration, here's a remarkable, often overlooked fact. In the months following the collapse of the partition plan and the eruption of war, the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Palestine helped galvanize global support for human rights. This urgency directly influenced the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the UN adopted on December 10, 1948. The suffering witnessed in Palestine, along with horrors still fresh from World War II, convinced world leaders that protecting human dignity everywhere was no longer optional, but essential for peace. Thank you for unraveling the story of the UN Partition Plan with us, a single vote that ignited a conflict still echoing in every peace summit, every border negotiation, and every family yearning for safety across the Middle East. If this exploration gave you new insight into the roots of one of the world's most enduring struggles, please support Armchair Archaeology by liking this video and subscribing, so we can keep bringing you powerful stories where history and today's headlines collide. Don't forget to activate the notification bell to stay updated on our next deep look into the events that shape our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think the lessons of 1947 apply to modern crises? What other pivotal moments or ancient mysteries would you like us to investigate next? Share your ideas in the comments below. Until our next episode, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the flame of curiosity burning bright, because understanding the past is the first step toward a better future.